Hello everyone and welcome to today's user testing webinar. My name is Adam Rector and I run the webinar program here at User Testing. Today we're very excited to have on Linda Bustos. She is the co-founder and managing partner at Edgacent, and before that she was the director of e-commerce research at ElasticPath. Her presentation today is about tackling the top 10 mobile commerce design challenges. Before we get started, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. I'm going to be taking over our Twitter feed for the next hour or so. Our handle is @usertesting, and we're going to be using the hashtag #UTWebinar. I'd love to hear any comments or insights that you guys are getting from today's webinar. We want to make today's presentation as interactive as possible, so if you have any questions for Linda, you can submit them using the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Remember, the earlier you send in your questions, the better chance we're going to have of getting to them. And lastly, and most importantly, we are recording today's webinar. So for everyone who registered, I'll be sending out an email in the next day or two with a link to the recording, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. That's it for my super quick housekeeping. Linda, I'm super excited to have you on today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Adam.
Awesome. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work history, and then you can jump straight into your presentation.
No problem. Well, I've been a UX and e-commerce buff for about 10 years now. In a past life, I wrote a blog called Get Elastic, which was an e-commerce blog, and nowadays I'm a co-founder of Edgacent. We're an e-commerce advisory firm, and right now I'm knee-deep in a project of writing a book, which is soup to nuts e-commerce best practices on the UX side from homepage right through to checkout. And you can actually read the chapters every week. I'm posting them on ecommerceillustrated.com. So this presentation today is actually a redux of exactly that, homepage through checkout on the mobile side. And what I've observed spending many late nights looking at the Internet Retailer Top 1000 mobile sites, squinting, cross-eyed, and just gathering examples of the most interruptive UX problems that we find on mobile e-commerce sites. But the good news is that a lot of them aren't terribly difficult to circumvent, and these are fairly quick wins that can have a real great impact on your user experience. So I'm going to jump right in. One just comment on the content today is that they're not the top 10 ranked in terms of severity. So the first one is not the least problematic and number one the most problematic. I've laid it out in terms of the customer journey, so when they land on your homepage and then we go right through to the checkout process. So the first issue is entry pop-ups. And these have been the bane of the web existence for a really long time, way back to Jacob Nielsen's original research on splash screens must die, and they've been resurrected on mobile as call to actions to download an app or to opt into an email or text message program. These bounce exchange and AppSumo type light boxes actually do convert fairly well, but they're not always considered when you move them onto the mobile experience, how they actually render, and they can cause bounce rate problems. So let's tackle the app store, or the app call to action first. When that takes over a screen and there's not a clear way to exit the splash and to actually get into the mobile site, that can be problematic because it's kind of akin to putting a big closed come back later sign on top of a physical store. This particular example, there's two things I want to call out. Number one, the opt out is no thanks, take me to the mobile site instead, but as you can see, it's very, very faint. So this is not the call to action that they're trying to emphasize. They're really trying to push you to download the app. The second challenge here is that it's free shipping and expedited shipping on your first app order, which is a little bit of price discrimination and offer discrimination for those that are going to download an app. And if your customer really just prefers to use your web experience, your HTML version of your mobile site, and doesn't want to make the commitment of downloading your app and using it that way, you are risking extra friction in that persuasion experience. This is a little bit better example. So there's the get the free app call to action, but it's a clear no thanks, take me to the website, and it's not suggesting that your website experience is going to be less awesome as the app experience, and it really gives the user the choice. This is an old version of Karmaloop's entry page to its mobile site, and as you can see, the Shop Our Mobile site is the nearly invisible call to action. It's pushed way down, and it doesn't even display completely in portrait mode on an iPhone. A second issue here is that it's very easy to use device detection and actually serve up, hey, we're recognizing you're on an iPhone or an Android, and making that just one call to action. But thankfully, Karmaloop has ditched this a really long time ago and is using a better way to do the call to action for the app, is to use these banners that appear at the top. They're easy and intuitive to close, and they don't interrupt the actual homepage content. Another issue is these opt-ins that span a little bit too far for portrait mode. So again, they haven't been QA'd properly from the desktop and tablet experience down to portrait mode on a smartphone. And what happens in this example is the only way you can get out of it and actually access the content behind is to be intuitive enough to tap on the grayed out area above or below. Not all customers are going to figure that out, and if they can't tap away from it and find an easy way to close, and they don't want to sign up, this is asking for marriage instead of the first date when somebody's first coming to your mobile site, it can be problematic, and you'll see bounce rates up to 90% on these kind of treatments. We've seen this before. Another challenge is when there's not a grayed out background, and then you can see the sign me up call to action is actually overlaid on top of background content on the home page. It's just messy, difficult to understand where to click, where to go, what to do. And here's another example. The opt-out, the X is there, but it's just squeeze it a little bit down, a little bit better to fit within the portrait mode. That's a better experience. That's another example. So the second issue I want to talk about is hero header fails. So if you've been following a lot of the conversion optimization gurus, and there's even a website called shouldIuseacarousel.com, and it's a bunch of funny quotes and poignant quotes from folks that do A/B testing all the time, is on the web. These hero headers that scroll and rotating banners are problematic on the web, and when they're shrunken down to the mobile site, they're problematic too. As you can see in both of these examples, they cover up the call to action. They're not useful, they're not helpful, and even when you use a static image, this can also be a challenge where text is being shrunken down, it's unreadable, especially white text on a busy background, and this just happens on the top websites. The top Internet Retailer 500 are mostly all doing this, where the banner content that's optimized for the web is tried to be shrunk down through a responsive site and just doesn't translate to a good user experience. Another issue that can happen is the actual really brandy, artsy content that is created at a very high level by an art director, a photographer, brand team, and then that content is handed over to the web team, and then possibly, depending on how your organization works, is handed over to a mobile team, and you got to use that on the web. It's not optimized for the web because the process is broken right up at the photo shoot level. That art director is not thinking about what shot is going to look best on mobile. So if you are in charge of the mobile experience, something to consider is pushing for the autonomy to be able to either ditch the images that don't look good on mobile or have the freedom and flexibility to crop images where they make more sense. And again, here, Neiman Marcus, really big brand, it's very difficult to read what they're trying to say on this banner, and it's just taking up space away from actual merchandise content and other products and offers. This is getting a little closer to a good experience. We see at the bottom, find a store and coupon and deals. You know that those were designed with mobile first in mind. The rest of the content is getting there. These tappable blocks, the text and images that are optimized for chunking for the online experience. But the problem here again is the light text on medium contrast background and all caps, more difficult to read. So I'd give this, it's halfway there. It's getting there. I really like this art.com example. This is actually a responsive experience, so if you looked at the version of this site on that same day on a desktop, it would be the same graphics. And you might say, well, art.com, they're supposed to be selling images, they're supposed to be selling art. Why aren't they putting art on the homepage? But when you think about a catalog that has a lot of products and your chances of putting the best and most relevant to any user at a given time merchandising on the homepage, you may be better off. Of course, you can A/B test this, but you may be better off really using your mobile homepage as a place to put your value propositions, what's going on in terms of coupons, sales, specials, what's new. The goal of the homepage is to get someone off the homepage and deeper into the click. Make a decision through your navigation menus on what category they want to look at, or tell them what's going on. So definitely taking an approach and looking to create home pages that are very mobile optimized and easier to use on that front is a good approach. So hamburger menus, I like to call them Adidas menus because they're kind of like those 3 bars. So whether you call them hamburgers or Adidas menus, you're both right. They're really common. This is what typical mobile e-commerce site will have, the 3 bars somewhere within the menu, no matter how many other icons are visible. And where it gets problematic is when designers, there is no consistency around what that menu actually holds behind it. So every mobile site that you go to, you need to kind of explore around and see what's behind there. And you every once in a while get a site like this where they're using 2 menus. So you've got menu and menu. And the user has to actually interact with the menus to see what's behind it. Another challenge is when the mobile menu, the hamburger menu, is placed in an area where it shouldn't be. So for this example, it's placed where a normal search execution button should be. So is this the button that you press after you're trying a search, or is this the main menu? So you want to watch out for those little gotchas. Another gotcha is getting creative with the design of the menu, trying to be a little rebellious here. And this actual three-stacked menu is common on sites like YouTube. If you want to expand comments on different applications and different sites, this 3-stack thing means different things. And so I'll just give you a second to take a little guess at what you think you'd find if you interacted with that little 3-dot icon. Are you ready? It's actually login, so not too intuitive. For Cherish, the site is Cherish, and it's a marketplace for selling and also buying, so it makes sense that behind sell and browse is actually going to be category content. But again, when icons don't have clarity applied to them, they become more of a usability problem. So a lot of sites now are combining a label with the menus, and that's great, especially for store locators, which kind of looks like a Ouija board pointer. Not everybody intuitively understands that that's a store locator, and they tend to be designed slightly different across sites. They're less standard than the hamburger menu. So adding some context with a label is fantastic, but I want to share one of my very favorite A/B tests from Conversion Excel, where they actually took 4 treatments, and spoiler alert, this was the winner, the Pepto-Bismol pink with the 3 bars and the menu label. It's kind of every single best practice that you would imagine shoved into one, and of course it won because there's a high contrast between that button and its background. So keep that in mind. But what was the impact of this winning test? It was a 6% revenue lift. It was almost 3% more add to cart interaction, an increase of 5% conversion rate, and that of course equated to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year from a very single test. So the key that you want to keep in mind is really that menu in context of everything else that's going on in the design. So in this case, if you take a look at it, they've got a menu on the right-hand side, and there's a big assumption that everybody knows that that's the menu, but the screaming calls to action are down at the bottom. It looks like what you do when you land on this site is, that this is a social site. If you don't know what Hatchery is, you might be confused about whether this is an e-commerce site at all. And also you want to consider that folks very familiar with apps tend to have large interactive buttons at the bottom so the thumb can access it easily. So this is something that I would definitely recommend testing a different treatment for and seeing what the impact would be of making the actual call to action the menu. Macy's at one point actually really took a literal approach and said, tap this menu icon to find more of what you love faster. This is something you can experiment with, but depending on your audience, and we are now in 2016 and a lot of folks understand that this is a menu, something you can experiment with. It's an option to try. And then finally, I'm not a big proponent of just adopting whatever Amazon's doing, but notice that Amazon doesn't even use a hamburger menu at all. So there's a clarity here where you come to this site, you can look at some of the stuff on the homepage, you can do a search, but you're here to look at categories, and we have a shop by department button. All right, let's talk about mixed menus, and this follows on the theme of the hamburger menus and not knowing what's behind that 3 bars and how that can get the problem that it's not standardized and conventional across all mobile sites. One thing that frequently happens is that search and other important elements get kind of combined into that hamburger menu, which is also used for shopping and all sorts of other stuff. So that can be a user issue. We see this here again too. If the user is really expecting that hamburger menu is going to bring up categories, it can be confusing when there's all sorts of account features and there's search and profile and login. And on this particular site, you'd actually have to start interacting with the jewelry button or the gifts button. And now there's categories located behind 2 different menus, and that can be problematic. I've also seen examples like this where cart and checkout are actually hidden under something like account, and that's obviously challenging. And another mixed menu issue that can happen is that a menu is so long and there's no visual treatment to provide any context around the difference between menu items. So as you can see, if you notice the first link, so this is Bowden.com, by the way. So they've had all of their categories nicely presented in alphabetical order. So if you're scanning for a specific category, you kind of can pick up that I'm looking for shirts, so I'm going to scroll down a little further. But this is a very long menu, as you can see, and it doesn't stop when it hits workwear collection. It's putting in thematic categories like clearance, top rated, denim shop, Bowden basics, whatever that means, trends, Bowden icons, whatever that means. They're shoved right into the same menu, and then that becomes really, really difficult to parse in your mind. So much better way to do this is to really have a visual treatment that says, okay, if we're shopping by category, these are our categories. If you want more ways to shop, such as daily sales or top rated or picks for the week, then give it a different visual treatment. Here's another example, using either color or different styled icons, different colors to give that context around that, and just makes it easier on the eyes and makes it easier to understand your menu. So, accidental activation. I have little baby fingers and I still, I messed up on both of these sites. I could not consistently execute the search versus the cart by tapping. This is a problem on mobile sites when any element is squished too close together, whether it be in the navigation menu or whether it be in the breadcrumbs that are placed too close together or calls to action that are stacked. You want to have at least a 5 to 7 pixel hit area in between the actual executable elements so that this accidental activation and frustration that it causes is less likely to happen. This also happens a lot in these footer menus where links for the sake of space and maybe clean design are kind of small and stacked. They're not big buttons and large tappable targets. Another area where accidental activation can happen is when you're scrolling through a category list and if the hover state hasn't been deactivated on the category list. So for example, turning the the apparel product backwards, you can see the back of the dress. This will execute as the thumb is going through the product list, and then the user notices, oh wow, that's cool. I want to see the back of this dress. And as soon as you interact with any other element, it just kicks you out of the product list and takes you to the product page. So just really want to make sure that you don't have, either on the home page or category list pages, sensitive hit areas, touch areas that are going to start interacting unexpectedly and then not work as the user expects. So let's talk about pagination and infinite scroll next. So depending on your catalog architecture, how you've decided to, how many layers of your catalog navigation you have, etc., you can end up with categories with up to 27,000 SKUs. On mobile, nobody's got time to scroll through that many paginated links or that many auto scrolls. Nobody's got time for that. So again, you know, when you're presented with a, wow, 33 pages in this category, this is tough, this is tedious. And on mobile, you know, it's going to be the first 2 or 3 pages, and then maybe someone runs out of time or patience. So you really want to give, this is a trend that I love to see, is having a landing page for your category page which graphically presents and asks that customer to make a decision and a commitment to a subcategory. Obviously, that's going to reduce the number of products that you show in the list, and it's also a bit of guided selling. So instead of just making them use filters and sorts, which are very difficult to use on mobile sites because they pull up drop-down menus and it's just more navigation menus, this is really nice. And you can have 2 or 3 layers of this. So if I clicked into gemstone rings, then I might hit another page that looks like this that asks me to select my actual stone and filter that way, or by cut or by color, any of those things. And that's more of a guided selling process, and that's better experience on mobile. And if you've ever experienced a category page that auto loads, that you know, this works great on social networks and news feeds, because as soon as you interact with some content at the top, you've looked at it, you know, you've taken notice of it, and you just want to see what's next, that's fine. But with an e-commerce catalog, oftentimes you want to see what's there and then find something to click. And after a few episodes of a catalog page updating really, really quickly, you can find yourself lost. The second problem is, here you get teased for a very fraction of a second that there's some footer menu. Sometimes there's shipping information or customer service stuff you want to access in the footer menu, and it's impossible to actually reach the end because it just continues to auto load. So the best practice to handle this is actually to use a button where you put the user in control and say, okay, this is also a performance optimization too, right? So you're gonna load the next 15 products, maybe 20. It's nice to give the customer some indication of how many products are gonna load next, but it still gives that customer the opportunity to interact with anything that is in your footer menu. And it also gives control of their actual experience. So if you got to the end of the first 15 frames on the Glasses USA site on the left, you might say, okay, yeah, before I load anything new, I'm going to scroll back right now because there was something that I liked. That's an example, right? It just really puts the user in more control than hijacking them and automatically appending the results. And speaking of getting lost in the flow, disappearing context. This happens as a nature of scrolling, especially on mobile, because it's such a small area of content that you can present. So this often happens where, you know, I'm on home page and there's lots of content I'm looking at, but I don't see the menu anymore because it's disappeared out of my line of sight. So Guess Jeans doesn't use this anymore, but they did at one time, and I'm glad I have the screenshot because I think it's a great idea of taking an app approach to the HTML site and pinning some elements, and I'd argue that these aren't the best elements to pin for a universal experience. Maybe put the hamburger menu in there and some other quick links, but pinning that at the bottom. Another way that you can do this is on a category page, is helping folks actually build a short list of products that they're going through using the favorite icon, so then those can kind of populate down at the bottom and be easily accessible. As you can see here, I love this example again. Glasses USA, they've pinned the filter and sort to the top of the screen so you always see it. So the customer that's maybe looked at 40 products and starts to see a trend of what they like, wow, I really like cat eye style frames. So I'm going to just stop scrolling here and I'm going to access the filter right away and say, just show me all the cat eye styles. Here's another way to do it, is not to pin it to the top, but kind of let it float. So art.com lets the filter icon just float there, and you can interact with it at any time. And this treatment of it also doesn't cover up as much content. So, you know, there's a trade-off between having a heavy pinned menu at the top, shows less actual content below it. So these are two options that you can look into. I love this example of adding the Add to Cart button as a pinned element, so that as you scroll through sometimes lots and lots and lots of information, including customer reviews and very detailed expand and collapse sections, that really important call to action that, you know, if you've ever tested an e-commerce site, that's one of the first things everyone wants to test, is the Add to Cart button on the product detail page. Here you just never lose that context, and it's always easy to access no matter where someone is on the product page. Yeah, and another example here is, this I see a lot, is where if there's multiple colors for a product image, once you get down to those thumbnail swatches to change the color, the product has already disappeared out of the iFlow. So when you change the color, you have to scroll back up. So this is actually a good example where this site has managed to actually fit them all within one portrait screen. The only criticism that I have of this is that the actual swatches for the colors, you can see 4 options here. There's more than that. And if you scrolled left and right on those colors, you would get to see more of the colors. And what they really need to have here is a back and forward icons to indicate that there's more to scroll this way and that way. Just as an alternative, if you don't want to stick the Add to Cart up at the top, you can stick it at the bottom. It's closer to the thumb. That might be an interesting A/B test to see whether it's engaged more when it's pinned to the top or the bottom. But Staples is another example of this, this tactic. Walmart pins the checkout button to the cart detail page, and this is great when you're scrolling down and there's other stuff to look at, like customers also bought, cross-sells, other things that you might be presenting on your cart page. So having that checkout pinned to the top or pinned to the bottom is really user-friendly. And so I recommend that. Now let's talk about fuzzy images, because this is rampant, and because it's a wild, wild west of devices out there, some folks are going to be using Retina display and some are going to be using older devices, and that becomes a problem in terms of, especially if you have a responsive web design, how are you going to handle the optimization of images? Because it's very simple for a user or a UX person to say, hey, just fix it. And it's not really that simple, because fuzzy images, whether they be logos or buttons, as you can see here, the promotional content, all of this is fuzzy. Sentiments isn't the only one that suffers from this. Walmart's category page has fuzzy product thumbnails, and when you click through to the product detail page, they're clear as day. So what's happening here? The challenge is that different types of images need to be optimized in different ways. So there's different actual development and coding stuff that you need to do for background images, hero shots, category thumbnails, logos and icons. There's pros and cons to the different approaches to optimize this too for Retina display, because it might be a trade-off between performance, there's a degree of difficulty for implementation, cross-browser support and cross-device support can be affected, and there's not really one rule of thumb on how to optimize for this. So you want to first of all make sure that optimizing images if you're not doing it, if you do suffer from certain elements on your site not showing up clearly. You have that discussion with the developer, designer, and talk about the ways that you can handle it and the pros and cons. Performance is a big one that you want to keep in mind, because the way that the Retina display works is basically a 2-to-1 ratio for pixels. So you would typically take an image, create a file twice as big, and then shrink it down back to the size you want to show it and display it for Retina so that it's twice as sharp. But that can cause performance issues in having to download all of these objects, download all of these bigger assets when you're on an older type device, and then it might not render properly for the older device. So what I'm trying to say here, this is probably the most difficult one to handle out of the 10 that we're talking about today, but the impact that it can have on your conversion and user experience is really that remember when older sites had those broken image links and you'd see some content show up and some being broken? This is almost like the next generation of it, because it can have an impact on brand and your brand image, but it can also have an impact on usability as in this Walmart example, that if patterns and fine details are fuzzy, then it's going to create the need for a lot of pogo sticking back and forth to see the product page. Okay, I got to see this pattern up close. Couldn't really get a good idea from the category page, and then there's a lot of bouncing back and forth, and that's not a good experience. So my recommendation is this is probably something that you want to bump up ahead of other types of features that you might want to build in. If it's going to be an extra coding or going to add a little bit more to your process, then it still is very worth it if it's happening. All right, let's talk about drop-down menus, and the reason why I chose this image is because if you've ever used the native UI, at least on the iPhone, you're seeing something that looks a lot like the Price is Right wheel, and like Snoop Dogg would say, you should be dropping those like they're hot, because they do cause a few problems with the user experience. One common problem, and this doesn't happen on every mobile site, but when you interact with the native UI dropdown and it pulls it up, it tends to blow up the background. It zooms you in. And not every site has coded it in the way that when you hit that done button that it resizes the screen. So you're left with a screen that you need to pinch and zoom, and then you continue to interact with it. And for a lot of products, you know, configuring a size, a style, any personalization, and shipping options, quantity, all of those steps in the product configuration require pulling up a new menu. So this can be a really, really hassle-some experience when it's implemented that way. Even Bob Barker agrees on this. But the good news is that there's a bunch of ways that you can do this without having to invoke the drop-down menu. So one of them would be a plus and minus button here. You can adjust the quantity really quickly with just a tap. It's very intuitive. When you're handling product colors, for example, and oftentimes products are named creatively, and they're like dusk and merlot, so it's not just red and green. And the challenge there is that when you're pulling up a drop-down menu, you can't offer color context. You can't offer a product swatch next to it. It just doesn't work. So on the right-hand example, we got Virginia walnut and warm oak, and if you had your eyes closed, you probably couldn't imagine what the difference between those two are. But using this kind of an in-screen drop-down, you can show that context and help the customer really understand what they're selecting. I love this. Kate Spade has redeemed itself from the accidental activation menu by creating such a user-friendly filter and sort. And not only can you easily scan this filter and sort menu, you can tap. It's very finger-friendly to tap, but you can make multiple selections without having to reload a page. And a lot of the sites that pull drop-down menus for filter and sort that I've tested, you have to do the application one at a time. So if I click Faux Fur once, it's going to kick me out of the drop-down menu, update results, and if I want to apply a second filter, I've got to interact with it again. It's just a horrible experience. So this is a much better way to approach it. You can use it for sort menus as well. And again, with that multi-step product configuration, this is so great. You don't have to pull up anything. Actually, in this example, the quantity is a drop-down, which could easily be fixed, but on the whole, 3 out of 4 ain't bad of being able to tap to configure your selection before you add to cart. Radio buttons are also great if you have only a few options, and these are all done in a very nice, user-friendly way. And most e-commerce mobile sites are going to be using the drop-down for the delivery menu. So kudos to both Burton and Walmart for applying it this way. And this is my absolute all-time favorite because, as you know, selecting a country and selecting a state is a minimum of 50 items in that drop-down list, and it's just a pain to scroll through them all. And sometimes if you're a little too aggressive with your thumb, that menu just starts spinning. And if it's something not an alphabetized list, if you just have maybe 20 colors to pick, then that user is relying on recall for everything that slips out of that viewport in the drop-down menu. So really great to just embed these into the on-site experience. It can be done. This is a fantastic example of that. And finally, we're moving on to the money-making, the money shots of the e-commerce optimization process. This is mobile checkout. So I'm going to cover 2 of the most important things to remember in mobile checkout. So several years ago, Forrester Research put out a report where they tested and found that 24% of customers would jump ship and not check out. And this is on desktop, mind you, because it's a few years ago, but if they were forced to register. And on email or on mobile, it's a lot more of hassle to sign up and register, right? Because we're working with mobile forms. There's some challenges that happen with filling in mobile forms, which I'll get to in a second. So it's so important to make that guest checkout option clear. And as many as folks like to argue that the fold doesn't matter anymore, we're talking about mobile. We're talking about devices that are going to be using a standard, whether you're on the iPhone 6 or the 6 Plus, or the iPhone 5C or whatever device that you're detecting, you're going to know what size that fold is in the browser. It's not like the desktop where anybody's unique sizing of their own browser is up to them, and the fold really can't be predicted. So when I use the term mobile fold, I'm talking about portrait mode, and just if you're going to QA your site, I'd like you to keep in mind what the experience is when the first thing that's shown is returning customer sign in, or if there is a call to action for guest checkout, it is buried in, you have to scroll down to access it. Here's an example where checkout now for Cabela's actually means guest checkout, but because they're not using the label guest checkout, that's not intuitive. And for all the new customer knows, checkout now means log in and continue checkout. It almost looks, and some folks will assume that that's the only way to get going on this order. But if they scroll down a little bit, if they thought to do it or committed to doing that, they would have seen the checkout now button. Again, my criticism here is going to be that the language, the label, is not using that trigger word, guest checkout. It's really important because our brains like to take shortcuts. We read empty fields, we read button text, and the peripherals around it often gets skipped over. So put that guest checkout on the button. So this is actually LL Bean's site, and I'm going to confess that I did a little bit of a Photoshop treatment on this to show what it would look like if it all fit in a screen. When I took the actual screenshot, I had to scroll down and take 2 screenshots to get the second button. But this would be a really easy fix, is to move it on up, make sure that someone can see login and checkout, and they can see checkout as a guest clearly. My preference is to put checkout as a guest first in the flow, because even returning customers don't always remember their email address and password combination, and just let them check out as a guest if they're trying to get through quickly. This is Sony, and I like how they put checkout as a guest first, but again, I'm going to harp on the issue of these two buttons both say continue, and our brains are scanning for how we can do things quickly. So both say continue. That doesn't guide me to which section I want to start with. I want to see sign in or check out as a guest here. So on the left, this is Rakuten's sign in, and again, they've got, they're emphasizing sign in. They're actually calling the page sign in as well. So once you get to checkout and you're presented with a page title that says sign in, you're feeling like they're going to force you to do things. And, again, there's two other calls to action. It does say checkout as a guest, but now you're forcing the customer to make a decision between registering now or checkout as a guest. There's not a lot of context around this about what the benefit of registering is, and it is forcing someone to make a decision. So this is my artist rendition on the right-hand side. What I would love to A/B test if I could get my hands on this site. I would change the top to checkout. I would move checkout as a guest as the primary bold call to action, and of course, if somebody's returning with an account and they want the convenience of doing that, they're not going to overlook that sign-in screen. Now, another thing you can consider is just bypass that step one altogether and just take someone directly into the guest checkout. And then if somebody has an account, they can log in. So as you can see on the left hand for Sony, if you already have an account, you can log in. One thing to keep in mind here is that our human brains like to just start autopilot typing in fields, so you will get some returning customers to just end up checking out as though they were a guest, but that might be a trade-off that you want to make in terms of better usability and a quicker way through the flow. I also like how country is presented first, because then that can, pull up the right field if you're shipping internationally. Sometimes the mobile form fields are different, and oftentimes the country is put so far down in the flow that once you get to the country and it pops things up, sometimes that can make little changes. So I like that. I also, on the right-hand side, this is Victoria's Secret. There is an alternative to creating an account or logging in, which is PayPal, which will just pull all the addresses and the billing information directly from the PayPal account. And oftentimes I see that presented almost like right where somebody is going to choose to use PayPal or Visa, and they've already entered in their billing information and shipping information kind of for nothing, because once they just get to checkout with PayPal, that's just going to kick them out of the flow anyway. So I like how this is presented first. But big, bold calls to action if you want to sign in, if you want to check out with PayPal, or if you just want to continue as a guest. Now, this is the Amazon way, and this has been adopted by sites like Sears and Barnes & Noble and several others. And the beauty of this flow, and this has really, really worked for Amazon, is that you give everybody the same flow. And the beautiful thing about asking for an email address first is if they don't make it through the checkout completely, you can recover that cart and email them and say, hey, do you want to pick up where you left off? You don't leave somebody completely anonymous after abandonment. And, everybody enters that first field first, and then you just choose whether you have a password or if you want to continue as a guest and create your password within the checkout flow. All right, now we're going to talk about the actual mobile form field usability. And these are really easy fixes, but they're really common hiccups. So first one is autocorrect for fields like first name, last name, address, company, that kind of thing. You want to disable the autocorrect, because as touched as I am that autocorrect is trying to suggest that I'm kind, I'm not kind to Bustos, I am Linda Bustos, and I don't want to have that extra piece of friction of either having it autocorrect for me or having to close the autocorrect suggestion. So just don't do it. This can also happen with email addresses. Oftentimes it auto-capitalizes the first letter. Don't have autocorrect in email addresses. Second thing is you want to pull up the email optimized keyboard. As you can see here, they've got the @ symbol and the period so that you don't have to toggle between the regular QWERTY keyboard and then the special character keyboard. So this is such an easy fix, and it really makes a smoother checkout process on mobile. And again, on addresses, right? Addresses typically start with a number, so you might consider default pulling up the number so they can get started with that right away. And you want to disable the auto correction on this field as well. However, zip and postal code is usually, well, if you're in anywhere outside of the US, it's going to start with an alphabetical character. But if you know somebody is already selected, in this example, say their state is Colorado, you know that they're going to be just typing in numbers for their zip code. So better to invoke the numeric keypad. And same with credit cards, telephone numbers, expiration dates, security codes. Be pulling up a nice little keypad like this. So much better experience once you hit the credit card number field, not having to fiddle around with the regular menu and pull up that second menu. And you will find a few sites using this scan credit card, as you can see on the right, and leveraging the image feature of the phone, and that is certainly something that you can play around with as well. That's all I have. I'm ready to open up for questions and invite you to check out our blog at ecommerceillustrated.com. We're talking about this all day, every day.
Hey, Linda, that was great. And I actually put the link to the Ecommerce Illustrated blog in the chat window, so everybody should have that as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
Also, yeah, we'll just jump straight into questions then. First one is, Facebook Android app has a hamburger menu. Should the goal be to eliminate the hamburger menu or to explain it better to users?
Well, that is exactly the thing. It is conventional now, and that hamburger menu is going to be on most sites that you look at. The challenge is that what's behind it is not standardized. So adding a label for clarity, putting menu underneath the 3 bars, is one step towards extra clarity. As you saw in some of the examples there, that there were menu and then menu. So there was a button with the text label menu, and there was a hamburger menu, and it wasn't really clear what was behind there. And some of the hamburger menus had important elements like store locator and search buried underneath the menu. So I think the first step is you can run an A/B test on the actual clarity and the design and the treatment, as in the diamond candles example. That was clearly they had great success with testing that. Then the second thing is just think about the user experience and what makes it most easy for them to understand the way that your menu works. And that tip would be, you can have your category stuff and have maybe an account link or something behind the main menu, but give it a different visual treatment and give it different colors, give it different, break up that menu. You might even just consider having a shop button. So I've seen that a lot. A button, instead of the hamburger menu, just say shop, and then you can have another menu for account stuff just behind an icon with a head. You don't even have to use the hamburger menu. But lots of ideas to test there, and just what you want to keep in mind is what's the easiest way to get your customer to what they're looking for.
Gotcha. And you talked a lot about testing. What tools are you using for A/B testing? Well,
you can use whatever tool you want, right? You can use, Google just launched a brand new one, which I haven't played around with, the 360, but Optimizely is a really popular one. With mobile, you want to make sure that you are segmenting it by the mobile experience, obviously, but really, Personally, I'm tool agnostic. I don't advocate for one tool or another. It really depends on what you're using now and what features you want out of the tool.
Okay, excellent. Let's see. Next question is, how do you decide what needs to be A/B tested on your site as you're going through everything?
Well, that's where it's art and science, right? So the science is the number part of actually running the test, and it's really easy to just test what you can test versus what has the most amount of impact. So the way I like to approach that, first of all, is to start with your web analytics and try and see if you can find hints of where your conversion drop-off is. Maybe it's from the category pages, right? If it's from the category pages, you want to look at maybe it's the sort and filter tools, maybe it's a pagination issue, maybe it's the way that the auto-loading is happening, maybe it's that images are too small to really get context. You know, is there anything there that's forcing the customer to pogo stick between the category list and the product page? Maybe it's something that's happening with your mobile search. Maybe it's happening, like, definitely put the events tracking where you can see the actual engagement with the navigation menu and what do people engage with that hamburger menu, what do they click. Where in the site are you getting higher than average drop-off? And you might even want to compare that to your desktop site and say, you know, our typical customer does tend to go through the whole experience just fine, but on mobile we're seeing a big issue here or there. So I would start with whatever insights you can glean from the data that you have. You might also want to do some user testing too to get some qualitative talking out loud issues that will help you point in the right direction first, rather than saying, hey, I saw Linda do a webinar and she said this is really disruptive, so we can start there. Yeah, I would always start with actually the entire context of your site. And if you've been around UX for a long time, you might have some gut instinct too about what on the site might be potentially problematic. Look at your product detail pages, because that's one where there could be a lot of debate about, do you put the product description first or do you put the call to action button first? I've seen it where the description appears below the add to cart button and below you know, other graphic elements, and by default it's collapsed. So the customer might not even notice that you have a product description, and you might form a hypothesis that we could get some more ads or we could get some more use on the mobile site if we defaulted certain sections expand and collapse. So in a way, the mobile site actually has a lot more hypotheses you can form than even on the desktop site, because there's just more ways that you can handle content, and there's more things for folks to overlook and not see in the screen. So it definitely would be in the context of what you have now, and then forming, like, if we did this differently, what could happen. Another caveat, and this is a tough one because the mobile site often is used as a touch point where people are exploring, you know, they're clicking through from a social link or an email, and they're looking at your site and consuming content, but their intent from that visit was not to actually go check out on anything. So you might be getting a lot more site abandonment, and that, you know, it still was a positive that someone came and interacted with your brand that day and looked around, and they might in their head be thinking, that was awesome, I'm going to come back and go and visit the store, or I'm going to go and look online. And because the mobile is also used in store a lot, you don't know whether that abandonment was actually resulted in a purchase in store. So it's a little bit trickier too to kind of diagnose and really pinpoint where the what's the most important to test first. But those are a few ways that you can approach it.
Okay, excellent answer. That was, yeah, very comprehensive. I like them. Chelsea's asking about, do you have a favorite example of a mobile site that uses video?
Oh, wow. Well, from what I've heard from others that have tested video on sites, is that it's tougher on mobile sites. There's a performance issue that can impact that. It really, really depends on. I don't have a personal one where I say this was a really great use of mobile video on a home page, but of course on a product detail page, videos are really great for a context. You know, if you present them that way. I showed an example in this webinar of Kate Spade when they had that. That was actually a video. So it was their banner was two folks sitting at a table, and it was shrunken down. It's hard to read the text, and there was a little tiny caret, which was, you know, the little white triangle, which indicated you can start a video. And I think the clarity of the call to action to start engaging with the video is really important. And I know some sites like to autoplay video. Don't know if that's the best experience on mobile. One thing is that folks are sometimes, out and about. You don't want audio to autoplay, so there's a few different considerations. But I don't have an off the top of my head like super great experience that I can point to that I'd say, this is a really great mobile video experience.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'd agree. It's I think it's difficult to do right, and I've yet to see a good example of it. The next question is from Dan, and he said, in the art.com example, the floating filter icon blocks some of the product images. Do you think this would actually lead to more accidental taps than providing a convenient way to scroll back to the top menu?
Yes, because especially with that one, it was placed on the left-hand side. So if you're right-handed and you're scrolling with your thumb, that is a hazard. It's a risk that could happen. I think there's ways that you can tune that it's not as sensitive, so you need a really firm tap or a real good indication that somebody is trying to interact with that versus a light brush over that area. And you can play around with moving that floater a little bit higher. I've also seen that floater on art.com actually on the left-hand side. So that screenshot, it was on the right, but I've seen it on the left, that exact same treatment. And of course, you're going to have a portion of the population who are left-handed that might accidentally engage with it too. Yes, it does also cover up some of the thumbnail images, which is not so great. So yeah, you have to keep those things in mind when deciding whether to do it pinned at the top or left or right or pinned at the bottom. I also want to mention that when you move from portrait to landscape mode, that can also impact on there. So if you have it pinned to the top and all of a sudden it expands across the top of the landscape mode, it cuts off even more. So you're not even seeing all of the thumbnail in context. So yeah, you got to think about all of those little nuances about mobile.
Gotcha. We have, I think, time for just a couple more questions, so I'll try to sneak some in here. Marcel asks, what is a good way for handling form validation? Should I show an error message near the wrong field?
Yes, do it. Inline validation is your friend. You definitely don't want to have something where there's errors all the way up at the top. And we've all seen this on e-commerce sites where there's a big exclamation mark, and then it outlines 3 or 4 things, or maybe 1 or 2 things, and then you have to scroll down and see what they're actually talking about. So if you can inline validate, that's great. Tell them immediately before they get down to the submission button. That's best practice for sure.
Gotcha. And speaking more form fields, do you recommend the form labels within the entry space or above the field?
Well, definitely not within the space if they're going to disappear once you start typing. The general iFlow is on mobile, you don't want to be putting it left aligned, right? So because that's just going to squeeze out the actual form field space in portrait mode. So you want to think about easy scannability, and within the field, obviously, it's going to allow for more fields to be visible at a single time. But if you do use them inline, just make sure they don't disappear.
Okay. And then Jamie has an interesting question. Do you recommend shortening content for mobile on registration pages? For example, instead of one long registration page, you paginate, login, shipping, etc.
Well, that's a really good question because there's different ways that you can handle a one-page checkout, right? You can use the expand collapse. You can use kind of like that inline validation, which almost does like an auto upload. So we talked about categories auto uploading, but it detects when you've entered that last field, and then all of a sudden it pops up new information. So the thing that you want to consider is that the perceived amount of difficulty, right? So on desktop, a long form, versus 3 or 4 steps. Oftentimes on desktop, you're going to have an indicator, a progress indicator along the top. I've seen progress indicators on mobile sites as well. But the one-page checkout really has become very popular, and I think that it doesn't matter as much about whether you do it in 2 or 3 steps as actually how smooth it is to get through that process. and you want to be pulling up the right keyboards and eliminating fields that you don't need and eliminating performance issues. So if it does load a new page and that takes 2 or 3 seconds to load a new page, then using one-page checkout is definitely going to feel like a more seamless experience and is going to actually be a more seamless experience.
Gotcha. And my last question, maybe 15, 30 seconds. What's the best way to stay up to date on all these, mobile commerce and e-commerce trends if you're not in consulting for e-commerce companies like yourself?
Well, actually, I think the easiest way is just to look at a lot of sites, and because we're all mobile users, and sometimes I look at sites and I think, did anybody who works at this site actually use the site on mobile? Because some of the stuff is just very almost Captain Obvious. So I think if you always think like your customer, you're gonna pick up some user experiences right away just on your own, and looking at other sites, in your industry. However, there's also a caveat of like if you designed your site and app, oftentimes those are designed in a way that like this makes sense to me. I understand hamburger menus in this way. Or designers might want to be creative and say, I don't want to use a hamburger menu. I'm going to use these 3 dots. And you can have that bias where you don't actually feel the pain that other people have. So keeping up to date, I think there are tons of blogs, and I'm trying to do as much on the mobile side as possible because I think there's almost a lack of people talking about mobile. It's still, even though it's been around for such a long time, it's not something that is covered as much as desktop experiences are in the e-commerce space. So I'm trying to make inroads there, but I also think that you can supplement your own education just by looking at a lot of sites. And if you want to, I mean, this is what I do. I go to Internet Retailers top 500 lists, and I just go through, look at the companies, and test out those sites. And you'll see trends, you'll see things that you like and that you don't like, and then you can start thinking about how you could incorporate those into your own experience.
Awesome. Yeah, fantastic answer. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. That was really great, and thank you again, Linda, for putting all of that together. Don't forget, a recording of today's webinar will be emailed out to everyone who registered either tomorrow or Friday, and it will be available on User Testing's website next week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thanks again to you, Linda.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks, everyone.